Hey everyone, Martin here at Orange Box Photography and welcome to the channel. So today marks the start of a new series of videos that I'm going to be doing. These are solely going to be aimed at beginner photographers. I'm going to create a separate playlist for this as well, so that they're all going to be grouped in one place to make them easier to find. So if that interests you, please subscribe up here somewhere. And you know, that'll keep you up to date with all the new videos that are coming out, and this plus many more videos. But basically I'm going to be releasing about once a week a new beginner video, and you know, to help beginners out there get to grips with photography. So today we're going to be looking at the exposure triangle. Look at each aspect in basic terms, what each aspect of the exposure triangle is, and then in future videos we'll go in more in depth as to what each aspect of the exposure triangle does. But for today it's really just a brief overview, what each part of it is, and then we'll go more in depth later on down the line. So here we have the exposure triangle. Now the exposure triangle is made up of three things: your ISO, your aperture, and your shutter speed. And as you can see, those three things independently or together can control the exposure of the images you're actually taking. So we'll look at each one in turn, just do a brief look at what each one is, and then, as I said before, we will go into more in depth in future videos. Your ISO controls the sensitivity of the sensor in the camera. So the more you increase your ISO, the more sensitive your sensor in your camera actually becomes to the light coming through the lens. Now there is a downside to increasing the ISO, and that is the more you increase the ISO, the more you introduce grain and artifacts into the pictures you're taking, and unfortunately if you push that too far, you can come out with really poor images. Although cameras these days are getting better and better, you know, at the high ISO levels, but in an ideal world you want to try to keep the ISO as low as you can, to keep the, you know, the grain and noise in your images as low as possible. So the next part of the exposure triangle is your aperture. Now you can think of the aperture as like your iris in your eye. If you were to go out into bright sunlight, what will happen is the pupil or iris in your eye would close really down as small as possible to let less light in so that you can actually see and adjust to the bright light outside. And likewise, if you were to come inside into a dark room or a dark place, your iris or pupil in your eye would open up as wide as possible to let as much light in so you can see inside. And this is pretty much how an iris in your lens works. So the aperture in your lens can be opened up really wide to let more light through, or it can be closed right down to a small opening to let less light through. Now the aperture itself does have a big effect on how your image looks. So a really large aperture, say f1.4 for example, will give you a very shallow depth of field, whereas something like f8 or f11 will give you a very deep depth of field. And we'll touch on that in future videos, and we'll go more in depth on what it is. But basically the aperture will affect how much of your picture is in sharp focus and how much of it is blurry. But as I say, we will touch on that in future videos. So finally, the final part of the exposure triangle is the shutter. Now the shutter controls the duration on how long your sensor is exposed to the light coming through your lens. Now this can be for a very short period of time, like 1/1000th of a second, which is you could use to freeze action, or just to minimize light on a very bright day to get the right exposure. Or it could be for a very long period of time, like 1/30th of a second. And again, this could be used to either slow things down or just to reduce, increase the amount of light falling on the sensor so that you can actually get a balanced exposure when taking a picture. As you can see from the image, you've got three images there, one which has frozen motion, which would have been taken maybe at 1/1000th of a second, to the other extreme with a very slow shutter speed, which has caused motion blur because the actual duration of the image is over a longer period of time, for example 1/30th of a second. Now you can see I've also got a little video of the shutter opening and closing on a sensor for either a very short period or a long duration. But these are all things that can affect your overall images, and when taking a picture it really depends what you're trying to get. So if it was a landscape photography, for example, then really your aim is to try and get everything from the front of the image to the back of the image in focus and get as much depth of field as you possibly can in the image you're taking. And so in those cases, smaller apertures like f8, f11, f16, f22, and they're going to be really useful apertures for you, and then the shutter speed will be secondary to that. On the contrary to that though, if you were trying to freeze motion, if you had kids running around that you wanted to freeze the action on, or animals, then your priority will be your shutter speed, because you want to freeze that motion where it is. So you'd be using shutter speeds of 1/1000th of a second, for example, and then again your aperture would be secondary to that. It still will come into it because obviously the aperture does affect your depth of field, but still when you're trying to freeze motion, then your shutter speed is your priority. But the exposure triangle is there for that reason, is that you can adjust all three to achieve your ultimate image that you're trying to create. And as time goes on, as you learn these particular aspects of your camera, then you're going to be able to use all three of those to really nail the shot you're trying to nail. But we'll cover that more in depth in future videos, and that's all I've got time for now. If you guys have any comments, please comment below. Send me an email at orangebox321@gmail.com, and please don't forget to subscribe up there and for future videos that are coming out. That's it for now. Thanks a lot guys, catch you later, bye bye.